Encyclopedia section 187. The universal, which in the first conclusion was specified through individuality, passes over into the second figure and there now occupies the place that belongs to the immediate subject. In the second figure, it is concluded with the particular. By this conclusion, therefore, the universal is explicitly put as particular, and is now made to mediate between the two extremes, the places of which are occupied by two others, the particular and the places of which are occupied by the two others, the particular and the individual. This is the third figure of the syllogism. Number 3, P M dash U M dash I. What is an M dash? Why can I only make one on my phone? An M dash is a dash, as in if you say, well, there is a there is a character on the keyboard called a dash, and a dash is usually a fifth of a centimeter across. An M dash is the size of the letter M across. So when you hit dash, instead of having just a small, let's say a subtraction sign, you have a longer line between the letters, which is the same length as an M. I learned this from my primary instructor, if you want to call him that, or guru in the arts of metaphysics as they are presented in spirituality. His name is Noah, but called Nuh as it's an Arabic name, Harold M. Keller. And he runs or is over a Syriac, English, Arabic, apostolic community upon St. Paul's old community in Amman, Jordan. And so I've been studying with him for 20 years now, actually since the year 2003, and this is 2022. So we're at our 19th year. And some of it was there in Amman, and a lot of it has been at distance. And this entire, I was inspired to record and analyze and demarcate Hegel because of him. He mentioned at some point that he took courses at the University of Chicago, including from a great professor there who taught Hegel, specifically the encyclopedia that we're covering now, the Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And so I decided to offer a take on it because he has a Ukrainian German heritage, and he's teaching often amongst many people who are Caucasian, but also many Arabs and a few Africans and many South Asians from Pakistan and India. And so we learned a lot from the North African culture, where the group takes most of its instruction, and some of it also from Syria. But Syria has a great impact on Europe and from Germany and Spain. And so I felt listening to him, it was important to offer what his culture is. This, well, not this, but his culture, being a Ukrainian German, I also have a background which includes Balkan. So some places are these people walked across, and Nordic, Finnish, Swedish, amongst others, and Irish and English and some other Northern European cultures. And so I think this information is also essential to them as well, part of my culture. So this has been part of it. So that is my inspiration, and that's where I learned what an M dash is. So the figure is P M dash U M dash I, particular, universal, individual. You have individual, particular, universal, universal, particular, individual, particular, universal, individual. What are called the figures of the syllogism, being three in number, for the fourth is a superfluous and even absurd addition of the moderns to the three known to Aristotle, are in the usual mode of treatment put side by side without the slightest thought of showing their necessity, and still less of pointing out their import and value. No wonder, then, that the figures have been in later times treated as an empty piece of formalism. They have, however, a very real significance, derived from the necessity for every function or characteristic element of the notion to become the whole itself and to stand as mediating ground. But to find out what moods of the propositions, such as whether they may be universals or negatives, are needed to enable us to draw a correct conclusion in the different figures is a mechanical inquiry, which its purely mechanical nature and its intrinsic meaninglessness have very properly consigned to oblivion, and Aristotle would have been the last person to give any countenance to those who wish to attach importance to such inquiries or to the syllogism of understanding in general. It is true that he described these, as well as numerous other forms of mind and nature, and that he examined and expounded their specialities. Pardon, and that he examined and expounded their specialities. But in his metaphysical theories, as well as his theory of nature and mind, he was very far from taking as basis or criterion the syllogistic forms of the understanding. Indeed, it might be maintained that not one of these theories would ever have come into existence or been allowed to exist if it had been compelled to submit to the laws of understanding. With all the with all the descriptiveness and analytic faculty which Aristotle, after his fashion, is substantially strong in, his ruling principle is always the speculative notion, and that syllogistic of understanding, to which he first gave such a definite expression, is never allowed to intrude in the higher domain of philosophy. In their objective sense, the three figures of the syllogism, in their objective sense, the three figures of the syllogism declare that everything rational is manifested as a triple syllogism, that is to say, each one of the members takes in turn the place of the extremes as well as of the mean which reconciles them. Such, for example, is the case with the three branches of philosophy: the logical idea, nature, and mind. As we first see them, nature is the middle term which links the others together. Nature, the totality immediately before us, unfolds itself into the two extremes of the logical idea and mind. But mind is mind only when it is mediated through nature. Then, in the second place, mind, which he know, in the second place, mind, which we know as the principle of individuality, or as the actualizing principle, is the mean, and nature and the logical idea are the extremes. It is mind which cognizes the logical idea in nature, and which thus raises nature to its essence. In the third place, again, the logical idea itself becomes the mean. It is the absolute substance both of mind and of nature, the universal and all pervading principle. These are the members of the absolute syllogism. Once again, and this is the end of Encyclopedia section 187, about the individual I mentioned, uh, Nuh, N-U-H. You'll find his work at Nuh, N-U-H, Hamim. First letter is Ha, but spelled H-A. It's an Arabic letter. And the second letter, Meme, which is an M, spelled M-I-M. And Keller, K-E-L-L-E-R. So N-U-H, Keller, you'll find on Amazon. He has a book, I think his most famous, at least of general books. It's called A Port in the Storm, and is about finding the direction of prayer. There is something called a Qibla, Q-I-B-L-A. That word is Arabic, so I'll start with it in terms of the Qibla as it directs towards Mecca. And how do you direct yourself towards Mecca for prayer? For instance, whether it be prostration or it is just to know that you're aimed at that direction so you can get your prayer received at the Kaaba. What is that big black? Well, it's a cube made out of bricks covered in a black cloth, and so I believe it represents Sagittarius A star, the center of our galaxy, and by aiming yourself at it, you then in a hypercube kind of way, aim yourself at the center of the galaxy, uh, uh, and you direct your prayers, your desires toward it, and they collect together in some type of way, reach the grand computer in the sky, and they're processed and sent back out. But it's a book about how to find a direction of prayer, in this case, how to uh, make sure you aim exactly at Mecca when you are traveling over a sphere. And one of the arguments, as I understand it, is not only do you want to aim at it over the sphere, but you want to get there in the shortest direction possible. So if you're a pilot, for instance, or if you're going to fly uh, spacecraft, it's not that you just want to get from Earth to the moon, but you want to get there knowing that the moon is a moving object and the earth is a spinning object as well. So the moon is tidal locked to the earth. So you're just aiming at the surface, but it moves around the earth, but the earth moves, it rotates. And so how do you get there? And so there is a direct route. NASA has actually come up with a direct route and to keep your propulsion at the same time. In this case, from North America generally, the most direct and shortest route. Those two come into play. So you have uh, universal, or you have the individual, particular, and universal. So for the individual to reach the universal, it has to go through a particular route. And that route is north-northeast about for most places. And reaches over the curvature of the earth and down into the Arabian Peninsula, and it hits, it reaches the Kaaba that way. It's a direct. So if you wanted to aim a laser and have it bend over the curvature of the earth with the earth's gravity, it would reach it there. Others aim more directly, but they take the longer route with a bit more confidence. The Qibla is also important to many other traditions. Judaism and Islam and Judaism shared a common Qibla, a direction of prayer, which is Temple Mount in Jerusalem. To reach the stone there where the sacrifice of Isaac was said to have taken place, or was going to take place, or the sacrifice of Isaac to take place. That is one Qibla. There is a group called the Iglesia Gnostica Católica, the Gnostic Catholic Church. Its Qibla is in Loch Ness. I also have an affiliation with them. It is in Loch Ness at a particular place called Boleskine. And so it's a very similar system of establishing the Qibla and where it is from lots of places. Well, in North America, since you're aiming at Loch Ness, Scotland, it is also north-northeast, I should say, and the Qibla to Mecca is north-northeast. Some Jews pray directly east, uh, and so on. So the Qibla is a direction of prayer. So the book is called A Port in the Storm. He also has books of Islamic law. One is called The Reliance of the Traveler. There is a new translation. He spent about 14, if not more, years working with scholars to offer a translation, word by word, of the Quran into from Arabic, from its Arabic, a unique Arabic, even for the time it was a unique Arabic, into his English, which is an American English. So there's a new translation of the Quran by him as well. So NUH, first name, NUH, last name Keller, is a person you may want to look into. He has, a, again, like I call it, an apostolic, uh, a Syriac apostolic English Arabic community. It uses the word Allah, and that word is two words brought together. El, the ancient name of God, which means the high one, the highest one, the high God, most people will say. And law can, LAH, could be God, or it could be spirit or entity or a deity or important person. So it's the high God. And the high God, that name, Allah, is used by Syriac Christians when they pray to God. They say Allah. And it's also used by their derivatives, who are a late group of monophysite, uh, or a type of monophysite Christians who became Muslims and added their own book and their own prophet and disciple, as many groups have done. You'll find within the Jewish tradition different reverends and or rebbes or rabbis, great ones. You'll find within the Christian tradition saints like Saint Augustine or others who added significantly to the church. You'll find within the peripatetic Neoplatonic Aristotelian tradition, Hegel, who's adding his own take on this philosophy as well. So, and you have the prophet Joseph Smith, who found his own book in effectively his backyard, which had been placed there uh, some at that time 2,400 years prior, or maybe a little bit later than that, as it was still written by a family. So it had been placed there probably 1,400 years before, but had been begun 2,400 years before that day, around 600 BCE, it's dated, when folks left the Sinai Peninsula, or probably the Sinai Peninsula, near Israel, and took a boat, I believe, around Yemen, east, or I should say, yeah, east toward what is now Los Angeles, and taking their venture there when they landed in the Americas and began their work here, being becoming white Native Americans interacting with the red Native Americans, and their various interactions they had as well. So you have books and people who pronounce things later on who become important, just as important as a Jesus Christ, who was very, very different in his approach, but it said that he came over here as well. There were Egyptian ships that could have easily brought him over, and he had right to them, uh, and so did the Romans and others. So I'll leave you there with that understanding. There are just sometimes people become emotional when they receive information from a source that they've been told is not appropriate for them. So I'm not telling you to become a Muslim. I'm not telling you to become a Catholic or a Mormon or any of those. I'm letting you know that these traditions have extremely valuable or Neoplatonic, peripatetic, Aristotelian. I'm letting you know that these traditions, including Buddhism and Hinduism and others, have valuable and correct information, and you only have a bias toward them because you have a different tradition that wants to keep you in it. And I would advise, if you have a tradition, if you have a religious tradition, just stay with it, and do your best to be the best of that particular tradition you can. But don't deny the truth of other traditions, the truth being the logical conclusions you can draw from hearing from them. This is the Gnostic way. Okay, Encyclopedia section 188. In the round by which each constituent function assumes successively the place of mean and of the two extremes, their specific difference from each other has been superseded. In this form, where there is no distinction between its constituent elements, the syllogism at first has for its connective link equality, or the external identity of understanding. This is the quantitative or mathematical syllogism. If two things are equal to a third, they are equal to one another. Everybody knows that this quantitative syllogism appears as a mathematical axiom, which, like other axioms, is said to be a principle that does not admit of proof, and which, indeed, being self evident, does not require such proof. These mathematical axioms, however, are really nothing but logical propositions which, so far as they enunciate definite and particular thoughts, are deducible from the universal and self characterizing thought. To deduce them is to give their proof. To deduce them is to give their proof. That is true of the quantitative syllogism, to which mathematics gives the rank of an axiom. It is really the proximate result of the qualitative or immediate syllogism. Finally, the quantitative syllogism is the syllogism in utter formlessness. The difference between the terms which is required by the notion is suspended. The difference between the terms which is required by the notion is suspended. Extraneous circumstances alone can decide what propositions are to be premises here. And therefore, in applying this syllogism, we make a presupposition of what has been elsewhere proved and established. Encyclopedia section 189. Two results follow as to each form. In the first place, Each constituent element has taken the place and performed the function of the mean and therefore of the whole, thus implicitly losing its partial and abstract character. See Encyclopedia sections 182 and 184. Secondly, the mediation has been completed. See Encyclopedia section 185. Though the completion too is only implicit, that is, only as a circle of mediations which in turn presuppose each other. In the first figure, I, P, U, individual, particular, universal, the two premises I is P and P is U are yet without a mediation. So the two premises, individual is particular and particular is universal, are yet without a mediation. The former premise is mediated in the third. The latter is the second figure. But each of these two figures, again, for the mediation of its premises, presupposes the two others. In consequence of this, the mediating unity of the notion must be put no longer as an abstract particularity, but as a developed unity of the individual and universal, and in the first place a reflected unity of these elements. That is to say, the individuality gets at the same time the character of universality. A mean of this kind gives the syllogism of reflection. Hegel, Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Section 1, Logic, the science of the idea in and for itself, billahi that wa lillahi jama'a, Chapter 9, third subdivision of logic, the doctrine of the notion, quasi-subdivision A, the subjective notion, infra-subdivision C, the syllogism, meta-section beta, syllogism of reflection. Encyclopedia section 190, which will include 3 parts. If the mean, in the first place, be not only an abstract particular character of the subject, but at the same time all the individual concrete subjects which possess that character, but possess it only along with others, 1. We have the syllogism of allness. The major premise, however, which has for its subject the particular character, the terminus medius, as allness, presupposes the very conclusion which ought rather to have presupposed it.
Terminus medius.
Terminus medius are the middle term. Google Translate. It rests, therefore, number 2, on an induction in which the mean is given by the complete list of individuals as such, A, B, C, D, and so on account of the disparity, however, between universality and an immediate and empirical individuality, the list can never be complete. Induction therefore rests upon, number 3, analogy. The middle term of analogy is an individual, which, however, is understood as equivalent to its essential universality, its genus, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, or essential character. The first syllogism, so it is the universal of its degree or of its station. So its station is not kingdom, phylum, class, order, our family, it is genus, which is a station above species, our speciality. And so this individual is a universal in its station or at its degree. So going back to 3 analogy, the middle term of analogy is an individual, which, however, is understood as equivalent to its essential universality, its genus, or essential character. The first syllogism for its intermediation turns us over to the second, and the second turns us over to the third. But the third no less demands an intrinsically determinate universality, or an individuality as type of the genus after the round of the forms of external connection between individuality and universality has been run through in the figures of the reflective syllogism. By the syllogism of allness, the defect in the first form of the syllogism of understanding, noted in Encyclopedia section 184, is remedied, but only to give rise to a new defect. This defect is that the major premise itself presupposes what really ought to be the conclusion, and presupposes it as what is thus an immediate proposition. All men are mortal. Therefore, Caius is mortal. All metals conduct electricity. Therefore, ergo, copper does so. In order to enunciate these major premises, which, when they say all, mean the immediate individuals and are properly intended to be empirical propositions, it is requisite that the propositions about the individual man Caius or the individual metal copper should previously have been ascertained to be correct. Everyone feels not merely the pedantry, but the unmeaning formalism of such syllogisms as all men are mortal. Caius is a man, therefore Caius is mortal. What are men? What does it mean to be mortal? Is Caius something? It's a proper name. Is man and are is the word man and men, are they related with singular and plural? And again, Caius is mortal. So men, as we understand it, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, mammalia, if I'm not mistaken, uh, genus, human, species, overwhelmingly sapien, or Denisovian, or uh, what is called Neanderthalis, or there's another name, something similar to, I think it's uh, Iberian Balkan. Uh, those are some of the species that currently inhabit the earth in mixed form. Overwhelmingly, we talk about Homo sapien. So his genus is Homo, or man. Men is a plural, so there's more than one. So all men, all being something that implies more than one, often. All men, all homo are mortal. Mortals are alive, and at some point they are no longer alive. Caius is a name, it's a Roman name. It's a name that was used as a gerund. Uh, and Caius is a man, so you can know it's a proper name, but if you didn't know that it was a male name, it tells you that. Therefore, Caius is mortal. All men are mortal. Caius is a man, therefore, Caius is mortal. The point is, you want to say all of all Americans are free. Christopher is an American, therefore Christopher is free. So you would have to discuss what is an American, what does free mean, and what is Christopher, and then bring them together as another syllogism. But the point is, when you make a syllogism, or if you want to say all something, be sure that everyone listening knows the definition of the term. So define your terms, and then you can say all without having to say, well, not everyone. Well, I don't mean everyone. Well, you said everyone. I mean that amongst the different universals in my sentence, they have a certain characteristic. So there are universals in my sentence: men, free, American, and one of them, I'm going to talk about an individual, Christopher, is an American and is free. So there are universals, which are not everything. I didn't say everything was an American. I said all Americans. And every word that goes off is a definition or a limiting phrase. So you can get out of silly arguments with people who may just not be aware of, and because you haven't explained your terms, you engage in arguments with people who really just want the definitions of what the words are in your sentence. The syllogism of allness hands us over to the syllogism of induction, in which the individuals form the coupling mean. All metals conduct electricity is an empirical proposition derived from experiments made with each of the individual metals. How do we know all of the metals in the first place? Well, you have the periodic table of elements, and on the periodic table of elements, there are, we believe, all the elements represented at this point in our history. There's a time when we didn't know them all, and we know which ones are metal. And we know by experiments, those who experiment with these and those who theorize based on those experiments, even if they're different people, we know all metals conduct electricity because that's why they're named, one of the reasons why they're named metals on the periodic table. So we know this is true. So all metals conduct electricity is an empirical, empirical, is a scientific, proven scientific, I'll give you the definition, empirical, an adjective, based on, concerned with, or verifiable by observation or experience rather than theory or pure logic. They provided considerable empirical evidence to support their argument. All metals conduct electricity is an empirical proposition derived from experiments made with each of the individual metals. We thus get the syllogism of induction in the following shape. The shape is what is called a Calvary cross. There are 5 lines. So if you have a piece of paper, and if it's lined or not, you would need 5 individual lines on top of each other. Uh, in this, the first line in the central location is the letter I, and this is the individual. The second line, you have P, M dash I, M dash U. The eyes generally line up with each other, so you know how to center the PIU. The third line has another I, capital letters here, again, generally lined up with the other eyes in the cross, and that is a general cross there. You skip a line, and then you have a dot. I'll possibly learn what that is soon, or it's a period from a sentence. So I, P, I, U, I, dot, nukta. It's not a small period, it's a larger one, directly underneath the three eyes, as general as you can get. Individual, particular, individual, universal, individual, nothing, and then the monad is what that would be. And I apologize. So it's on the next page. There's another I as well. I'm sorry, not another I. So starting over, again, a cavalry cross, center I, and the I's remain in the center with this, lined up with each other. So I, first line, next line, P, long dash, or M dash I, long dash, or M dash U. So P, I, U, I, first line, P, I, U, second line, I, third line, skip a line, large dot called a monad. Next line, a large dot called a monad. And this is the shape that you see there. Gold is a metal. Silver is a metal. So is copper, lead, and the like. This is the major premise. Then comes the minor premise. All these bodies conduct electricity, and hence results the conclusion that all metals conduct electricity. The point which brings about a combination here is individuality in the shape of allness. But this syllogism once more hands us over to another syllogism. Its mean is constituted by the complete list of individuals. That presupposes that over a certain region, observation and experience are completed. But the things in question here are individuals, and so again we are landed in the progression ad infinitum. I, 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 and the like. In other words, in no induction can we ever exhaust the individuals. The all metals, all plants of our statements mean only all the metals, all the plants which we have hitherto become acquainted with. Every induction is consequently imperfect. One and the other observation, many it may be, have been made. But all the cases, all the individuals have not been observed. But this defect of induction, we are led on to analogy. By this defect of induction, we are led on to analogy. In the syllogism of analogy, we conclude from the fact that some things of a certain kind possess a certain quality, that the same quality is possessed by other things of the same kind, it would be a syllogism of analogy. For example, if we said, in all planets hitherto discovered, this has been found to be the law of motion. Consequently, a newly discovered planet will probably move according to the same law. In the experiential sciences, analogy deservedly occupies a high place and has led to results of the highest importance. Analogy is the instinct of reason, creating an anticipation that this or that characteristic, which experience has discovered has its root in the inner nature or kind of an object, and arguing on the faith of that anticipation. Analogy, it should be added, may be superficial or it may be thorough. It would certainly be a very bad analogy to argue that since the man Caius is a scholar and Titus also is a man, Titus will probably be a scholar too. And it would be bad because a man's learning is not an unconditional consequence of his manhood. Superficial analogies of this kind, however, are very frequently met with. It is often argued, for example, the earth is a celestial body, so is the moon, and it is therefore in all probability inhabited as well as the earth. The analogy is not one whit better than that previously mentioned. That the earth is inhabited does not depend on its being a celestial body, but in other conditions, such as the presence of an atmosphere and of water in connection with the atmosphere and the like. And these are precisely the conditions which the moon, so far as we know, does not possess. What has in modern times been called the philosophy of nature consists principally in a frivolous play with empty and external analogies, which, however, claim to be considered profound results. The natural consequence has been to discredit the philosophical study of nature. Hegel, Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Section 1, Logic, the science of the idea in and for itself, بالله الذات ولله جمع, Chapter 9, third subdivision of logic, the doctrine of the notion, quasi subdivision A, the subjective notion, infra subdivision C, the syllogism, meta section gamma, syllogism of necessity. Encyclopedia section 191, the syllogism of necessity. If we look to its purely abstract characteristics or terms, has for its meaning the universal in the same way as the syllogism of reflection has the individual, the latter being in the second and the former in the third figure, section Encyclopedia section 187. The universal is expressly put as in its very nature intrinsically determinate. In the first place, number one, and there are three parts to Encyclopedia section 191. The particular, meaning by the particular the specific genus or species, is the term for mediating the extremes, as is done in the categorical syllogism. Number two, the same office is performed by the individual, taking the individual as immediate being, so that it is as much mediating as mediated, as happens in the hypothetical syllogism. Number three, we have also the mediating universal, explicitly put as a totality of its particular members and as a single particular or exclusive individuality. which happens in the disjunctive syllogism. It is one and the same universal, which is in these terms of the disjunctive syllogism. They are only different forms for expressing it. Encyclopedia section 192. The syllogism has been taken conformably to the distinctions which it contains, and the general result of the course of their evolution has been to show that these differences work out their own abolition and destroy the notion's outwardness to its own self. And as we see in the first place, there are two parts to this one. Number one, each of the dynamic elements has proved itself the systematic whole of these elements. In short, a whole syllogism. They are consequently implicitly identical. In the second place, number two, the negation of their distinctions and of their mediation of one through another constitutes independency, so that it is one and the same universal, which is in these forms, and which is in this way also explicitly put as their identity. In this ideality of its dynamic elements, the syllogistic process may be described as essentially involving the negation of the characters through which its course runs, as being a meditative process through the suspension of mediation, as coupling the subject not with another, but with a suspended other, in one word, with itself. In the common logic, the doctrine of syllogism is supposed to conclude the first part, or what is called the elementary theory. It is followed by the second part, the doctrine of method, which proposes to show how a body of scientific knowledge is created by applying to existing objects the forms of thought discussed in the elementary part, whence these objects originate, and what the thought of objectivity, generally speaking, implies, are questions to which the logic of understanding vouchsafes no further answer. It believes thought to be a mere subjective and formal activity, and the the objective facts which confront thought to have a separate and permanent being, but this dualism is a half truth. And there is a want of intelligence in the procedure which at once accepts, without inquiring into their origin, the categories of subjectivity and objectivity. Both of them, subjectivity as well as objectivity, are certainly thoughts, even specific thoughts, which must show themselves founded on the universal and self-determining thought. This has here been done, at least for subjectivity. We have recognized it, or the notion subjective, which includes the notion proper, the judgment, and the syllogism as the dialectical result of the first two main stages of the logical idea, being and essence. To say that the notion is subjective and subjective only is so far quite correct, For the notion certainly is subjectivity itself, not less subjective than the notion are also the judgment and syllogism, and these forms, together with the so-called laws of thought, the laws of identity, difference, and sufficient ground, make up the contents of what is called the elements in the common logic. But we may go a step further. This subjectivity, with its functions of notion, judgment, and syllogism, is not like a set of empty compartments which has to get filled from without by separately existing objects. It would be truer to say that it is subjectivity itself, which, as dialectical, breaks through its own barriers and opens out into objectivity by means of the syllogism. Encyclopedia section 193. This realization of the notion, a realization in which the universal is this one totality withdrawn back into itself, of which the different members are no less the whole, and which has given itself a character of immediate unity by merging the mediation. This realization of the notion is the object. I, his transition from the subject, the notion in general. That may mean okay, I see it. Uh, pardon. This realization of the notion is the object. In his transition from the subject, the notion in general, and especially the syllogism, to the object may at the first glance appear strange, particularly if we look only at the syllogism of understanding, and suppose syllogizing to be only an act of consciousness. But that strangeness imposes on us no obligation to seek to make the transition plausible to the image-loving conception. The only question which can be considered is whether our usual conception of what is called an object approximately corresponds to the object as here described. By object is commonly understood not an abstract being or an existing thing merely, or any sort of actuality, but something independent, concrete, and self-complete. This completeness being the totality of the notion that the object, and written in German,
Objekt,
Objekt, Objekt, that the object, Objekt, is also an object to us.
Gegenstand,
Gegenstand. So the Objekt is an Gegenstand to us. I'm not familiar with the German grammar here, but he is comparing the two words together. That the object, Objekt, is also an object to us, Gegenstand, and is external to something else, will be more precisely seen when it puts itself in contrast with the subjective. At present, as that into which the notion has passed from its mediation, it is only immediate object and nothing more. Just as the notion is not describable as subjective, previous to the subsequent contrast with objectivity. Further, the object in general is the one total in itself still unspecified, the objective world as a whole, God, the absolute object. The object, however, has also difference attaching to it. It falls into pieces, indefinite in their multiplicity, making an objective world, and each of these individualized parts is also an objective, an intrinsically concrete, complete, and independent existence. Objectivity has been compared with being, existence, and actuality, and so too the transition to existence and actuality, not to being, for it is the primary and quite abstract immediate, may be compared with the transition to objectivity, the ground from which existence proceeds, and the reflective correlation which is merged in actuality, are nothing but the as yet imperfectly realized notion. They are only abstract aspects of it, the ground being its merely essence bred unity, and the correlation only the connection of real sides which are supposed to have only self-reflected being. The notion is the unity of the two, and the object is not a merely essence-like, but inherently universal unity, not only containing real distinctions, but containing them as totalities in itself. It is evident that in all these transitions there is a further purpose than merely to show the indissoluble connection between the notion or thought and being. It has been more than once remarked that being is nothing more than simple self-relation, and this meager category is certainly implied in the notion, or even in thought. But the meaning of these transitions is not to accept characteristics or categories as only implied, a fault which mars even the ontological argument for God's existence, when it is stated that being is one among realities. What such a transition does, what such a transition does, is to take the notion as it ought to be, primarily primarily characterized per se as a notion, with which this remote abstraction of being, or eve of objectivity, has as yet nothing to do, and looking at its specific character as a notional character alone, to see when and whether it passes over into a form which is different from the character as it belongs to the notion and appears in it. If the object, the product of this transition, be brought into relation with the notion, which, so far as its special form is concerned, has vanished in it, we may give a correct expression to the result by saying that notion, or if it be preferred, subjectivity and object are implicitly the same, but it is equally correct to say that they are different. In short, the two modes of expression are equally correct and incorrect. The true state of the case can be presented in no expressions of this kind. The implicit is an abstraction, still more partial and inadequate than the notion itself, of which the inadequacy is upon the whole suspended, by suspending itself to the object with its opposite inadequacy. Hence that implicitness also must, by its negation, give itself the character of explicitness, as, in every case, speculative identity is not the above mentioned triviality of an implicit identity of subject and object. This has been said often enough, yet it could be yet it could not be too often repeated if the intention were really to put an end to the stale and purely malicious misconception in regard to this identity, of which, however, there can be no reasonable expectation. Looking at that unity in a quite general way, and raising no objection to the one-sided form of its implicitness, we find it as the well-known presupposition of the ontological proof for the existence of God. There it appears as supreme perfection. Anselm, in whom the notable suggestion of this proof first occurs, no doubt originally restricted himself to the question whether a certain content was in our thinking only. His words are briefly these, in Latin, read by Google Translate.
Certe id quo maius cogitari nequit, non potest esse in intellectu solo. Si enim veli in solo intellectu est, potest cogitari esse et in re. Quod maius est. Si ergo id quo maius cogitari non potest. Est in solo intellectu. Id ipsum quo maius cogitari non potest. Est quo maius cogitari potest. Sed certe hoc esse non potest.
And translated by Google Translate as, certainly that the greater cannot be in the intellect soil, certainly that the greater cannot be in the intellect soil. If it is either in the intellect, can be thought to be in reality, which is greater. If therefore that which cannot be greater than the intellect, that is the greater, cannot be thought of, where it can be considered, but at least this is not possible. And by William Wallace, possibly from Hegel's translation, certainly that than which nothing greater can be thought cannot be in the intellect alone. For even if it is in the intellect alone, it can also be thought to exist in fact, and that is greater. If then that, than which nothing greater can be thought, is in the intellect alone, then the very thing which is greater than anything which can be thought can be exceeded in thought, but certainly this is impossible. The same unity received a more objective expression in Descartes, Spinoza, and others, While the theory of immediate certitude or fate presents it, on the contrary, in somewhat the same subjective aspect as Anselm, these institutionalists hold that in our consciousness, the attribute of being is indissoluble. The attribute of being in our consciousness, the attribute of being is indissolubly associated with the conception of God. The theory of faith brings even the conception of external finite things under the same inseparable nexus between the consciousness and the being of them, on the ground that perception presents them conjoined with the attribute of existence. And in so saying, it is no doubt correct. It would be utterly absurd, however, to suppose that the association in consciousness between existence and our conception of finite things is of the same description as the association between existence and the conception of God. To do so would be to forget that finite things are changeable and transient. In essence, that existence is associated with them for a season, but that the association is neither eternal nor inseparable. Speaking in the phraseology of the categories before us, we may say that to call a thing finite means that its objective existence is not in harmony with the thought of it, with its universal calling, its kind, and its end. Anselm, consequently, neglecting any such conjunction as occurs in finite things, has with good reason pronounced that only to be the perfect, which exists not merely in a subjective, but also in an objective mode, it does no good to put on airs against the ontological proof, as it is called, and against Anselm, thus dinning the perfect. The argument is one latent in every unsophisticated mind, and it recurs in every philosophy, even against its wish and without its knowledge, as may be seen in the theory of immediate belief. The real fault in the argumentation of Anselm is one which is chargeable on Descartes and Spinoza, as well as on the theory of immediate knowledge. It is this: this unity, which is enunciated as the supreme perfection, or, it may be, subjectively, as the true knowledge is presupposed. In essence, it is assumed only as potential. This identity, abstract as it thus appears, between the two categories may be at once met and opposed by their diversity. And this was the very answer given to Anselm long ago. In short, the conception and existence of the finite is set in antagonism to the infinite, for, as previously remarked, the finite possesses objectivity of such a kind as is at once incongruous with and different from the end or aim, its essence and notion, or the finite is such a conception and in such a way subjective that it does not involve existence. This objection and this antithesis are got over only by showing the finite to be untrue, and these categories in their separation to be inadequate and null. Their identity is thus seen to be one into which they spontaneously pass over, and in which they are reconciled.